The International Monetary Fund, IMF, faces accusations of imposing difficult conditions on developing countries, most of them in Africa, in exchange for loans. Those conditions are said to have far-reaching consequences on the borrower countries, including interference with internal governance, sinking nations deeper into debt, and creating a larger pool of poor people. Kenneth Rogoff, an American professor who worked as IMF's chief economist, says the lender gives loans to countries with exploding debt to GDP ratios. Simply put, the IMF extends loans to countries already struggling with existing debts. Rogoff gave the example of Ghana, which was already in debt distress in 2021, but the IMF gave it a loan of $1 billion for post-COVID-19 recovery. The IMF, in its assessment report of Ghana in July 2021, said, while noting that risks to Ghana's capacity to repay have increased, IMF's executive directors concurred that they are still manageable. In May 2023, the IMF added Ghana a $3 billion loan despite describing the country's debt as unsustainable. The funding was extended after Ghana defaulted on $30 billion loans in December 2022. But even as the IMF faces accusations of sinking debt-distressed countries, questions about its tough loan conditions continue to be posed. In June 2023, Tunisia's President Kais Saied rejected IMF's conditions for a $2 billion bailout. The IMF had asked Tunisia to restructure over 100 state-owned companies and remove subsidies on food and fuel. In June 2023, the president said IMF's conditions were like putting a matchstick on explosives. In Kenya, the IMF had in July 2022 asked the East African nation to remove maize and fuel subsidies introduced by the then-president Uhuru Kenyatta. Upon assuming office in September 2022, President William Ruto removed the subsidies, saying they were an economic burden. In December that year, IMF approved Kenya's $450 million loan request. IMF says fossil fuel subsidies is the main reason for high carbon emissions and revenue shortage. In its May 2019 report, the lender said if there were no fuel subsidies, global carbon emissions would have been 28% lower and tax revenues higher by 3.8% globally. The IMF says its preconditions, including calls for more taxes, are aimed at removing structural problems that may hamper economic stability. On average, there are about 25 conditions before an IMF loan gets approved. A study done by researchers from the universities of Cambridge and Oxford showed that between 1995 and 2014, the conditions IMF had imposed on 16 West African countries caused governments there to reduce healthcare budgets. The IMF extends two types of loans: a lending arrangement and an outright loan. A lending arrangement requires the borrower to meet conditions before getting a loan, while an outright loan does not have any preconditions. In the early 1980s, many African leaders took IMF and World Bank loans. Conditions including cuts on social spending were set. A World Bank report subsequently showed the number of people living below $1 a day in sub-Saharan Africa doubled from 164 million to 316 million between 1981 and 2001. The IMF and the World Bank are controlled by $1 one vote, and most of the voting shares are held by wealthy nations. The US alone holds enough shares in the IMF to give it veto power.